At 29, Madison Clark had built the kind of life she once thought belonged only to people in magazines. By day, she worked as a financial analyst in downtown San Francisco, surrounded by glass towers and the constant hum of ambition. By night, she returned to a quiet street in the Sunset District, where rows of pastel Victorian houses leaned into the ocean breeze. Her own house sat at the end of the block, a two-story Victorian painted soft gray with white trim. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. Every inch of it had been earned through years of restraint, saying no to weekend getaways, skipping dinners out, working late nights at the firm, even taking side projects just to push her savings higher. She had been 24 when she opened a separate account labeled House Fund. Now, 5 years later, she carried the keys in her purse and the mortgage in her name. It was more than a roof. It was proof that she could stand on her own feet, independent of anyone else's promises. Sometimes, as she turned the key after a long day, she would pause on the porch and whisper to herself, "This is mine. No one gave it to me. No one can take it away." That quiet affirmation made all the sacrifices feel worth it. It was during this fragile moment of pride, when she finally believed her independence was secure, that Ethan Brooks walked into her life. He appeared at the firm one Monday morning, introduced as the new head of sales. Tall, sharp-shouldered, with brown eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything. He carried himself with the calm confidence of a man used to being noticed. His smile had just enough warmth to feel personal, as though he saved it for her alone. Madison told herself to stay focused. She had just closed on her house. She had sworn she would pour the next few years into career growth, not relationships. But Ethan had a way of slipping past her defenses. In meetings, he lingered by her chair, asking questions that revealed he'd paid close attention to her reports. After one successful client pitch, he leaned close and said, "You've got instincts that can't be taught, Madison. Want to talk strategy over dinner?" Normally, she avoided situations that blurred personal and professional lines, but that evening she found herself sitting across from him in a small bistro near Market Street. They talked about everything but work, his travels, her favorite neighborhoods, the little quirks of city life. She was surprised at how easily laughter came, how quickly the hours disappeared. By the time he hailed a cab and insisted on walking her to her door, the spell was already forming. When he asked where she lived, Madison hesitated. She felt a sudden, sharp instinct not to reveal the truth. Something about the way his gaze flicked across her clothes, her handbag, the cab's meter, calculated, observant, made her protect her most precious secret. So she smiled and lied lightly. "I rent an apartment near the Civic Center. Nothing special." Ethan nodded, explaining that he was staying with his mother while looking for a place of his own. He shrugged, making it sound temporary, almost embarrassing. She found herself softening. They both seemed, in that moment, like two professionals carving out their futures piece by piece. But later, standing inside her Victorian with the door locked behind her, Madison leaned against the wall and let out a slow breath. She wasn't sure why she had lied. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was fear that revealing she already owned a home would tilt the balance, change the way he saw her. The house wasn't just a building. It was her shield, her fortress. And something deep in her gut told her to keep that shield hidden. As weeks passed, the relationship quickened. Ethan was attentive, generous with compliments, adept at knowing what she wanted before she voiced it. Flowers arrived at her office. He remembered the exact Pinot Noir she had once praised in passing. It felt almost magical, as if someone had handed him a list of her desires. Madison found herself swept into the kind of whirlwind romance she had only witnessed in other people's lives. Still, the secret of the house remained. Whenever Ethan dropped her off after a late dinner, she redirected him toward a different neighborhood, pretending her apartment was on another street. And when he finally stayed the night for the first time, she spun the same story she had used before. "This is my grandmother's house. She's with relatives in another state, so I'm just looking after it for now." Ethan's eyes had swept over the carved banisters, the high ceilings, the stained glass window in the stairwell. He whistled softly. Your grandmother's lucky. Victorian homes like this cost a fortune these days. Madison forced a smile, repeating the lie as casually as she could. She's always been generous. Letting me stay here is a blessing. She couldn't explain why the words came so easily, why the instinct to protect her ownership felt stronger with each passing day. All she knew was that the house, her house, was the one part of her life she refused to place in anyone else's hands. And even as Ethan's presence grew larger, as dinners turned into weekends and weekends blurred into talk of the future, Madison carried the secret like a hidden weapon. One day she might need it. For now, she let herself fall, believing that maybe love had found her at last, without realizing just how dangerous that lie about her grandmother would become. The weeks that followed were filled with small gestures and careful attention. Ethan seemed determined to prove himself the perfect partner. He called Madison in the middle of stressful workdays just to ask if she'd eaten lunch. He stocked her refrigerator with the oat milk he knew she preferred, learned the exact way she liked her coffee, and left handwritten notes tucked into her planner. It was disarming. Madison, who had built her life on self-sufficiency, found herself softening. She began to believe that maybe, for once, she could lean on someone else. Then Ethan told her he wanted her to meet his mother. "Victoria will love you," he said one Friday evening over dinner. His tone was bright, but his eyes carried a flicker of expectation. "She's protective, but once she knows you, she'll see what I see." Madison agreed, though a knot formed in her stomach. They met the following Sunday at a restaurant in the Marina District, a place with white tablecloths and framed photos of San Francisco's waterfront on the walls. Victoria Brooks was already seated when they arrived. She was in her early 60s, tall, with an upright posture that carried the authority of someone used to commanding rooms. Her silver hair was styled into a neat bob, and her pearl earrings gleamed under the light. She rose as they approached, her eyes sweeping Madison from head to toe in a single, assessing glance. "So this is Madison," she said, her smile precise, almost rehearsed. "At last." Her voice carried the measured cadence of a school principal, warm on the surface but edged with discipline. Through appetizers and polite conversation, Victoria maintained that same air. Friendly enough, but watchful, as if she were measuring Madison against a checklist only she knew. She asked about Madison's work in finance, her family, her goals for the future. Then came the questions that landed like stones dropped into calm water. "And your grandmother," Victoria said, folding her hands neatly. Ethan mentioned she has a house. "Where is it exactly?" Madison's fork froze halfway to her mouth. She swallowed, carefully keeping her expression neutral. "In Oregon," she said smoothly, echoing the story she had created. "She lives with relatives now, but she let me stay there for a while." Victoria's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, like a teacher catching a student in a half-truth. How generous of her. Is she still in good health? Madison smiled politely. She has her ups and downs, but she's sharp, very careful with her affairs. Victoria sipped her water, gaze never leaving Madison's face. "And she only has the one property?" "Yes," Madison answered, her voice calm though her pulse thudded in her ears. "Just the house." Ethan reached across the table, brushing Madison's hand lightly. "Mom," he said with practiced ease, "you're interrogating her." Victoria's lips curved in what might have been a laugh, though it held little mirth. "I'm simply interested. My son doesn't bring women home often. I want to know the person who may become part of our family." Her words dripped with a kind of courtesy that felt more like a warning. The rest of the meal passed in strained civility. Madison smiled and answered questions, but beneath the surface her unease grew. She had been through countless business negotiations in boardrooms, yet she had never felt so scrutinized. Victoria's eyes were sharp, not curious but calculating, as though she were searching for an angle, a weakness. Afterward, when they stepped outside into the cool air, Madison exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan slipped an arm around her shoulders. "She's tough," he admitted, a sheepish grin tugging at his lips. "Always has been. But don't take it personally." Madison raised an eyebrow. She was thorough. "She just worries about me," he explained quickly. "Ever since my dad left. She's been overly protective. That's all." The way he said it was meant to reassure, but it only deepened the pit in Madison's stomach. Something about Victoria's line of questioning hadn't been protective. It had been invasive, almost hungry. As Ethan hailed a cab, Madison glanced back through the restaurant window. Victoria was still at the table, watching them leave with a faint smile that never reached her eyes. For the first time since meeting Ethan, Madison felt the flicker of a warning she couldn't quite name. But when Ethan leaned close and kissed her temple, whispering, "Don't worry, she'll come around," Madison forced a smile. She told herself that maybe he was right. Maybe it was just a mother's concern. Still, as the cab pulled away and the city lights blurred past, Madison couldn't shake the memory of Victoria's gaze, sharp, probing, as if peeling back layers Madison had fought hard to protect. The wedding was small by San Francisco standards, almost modest. Madison had imagined something simple from the beginning, but she quickly realized her vision was not the one being carried out. Victoria Brooks inserted herself into nearly every decision, choosing the flowers, debating the seating arrangements, even insisting on which bakery to use for the cake. When Madison suggested a vineyard in Napa for the reception, Victoria dismissed it as too far, too impractical, and steered them toward a downtown hotel she claimed had better pedigree. Ethan, caught between them, would smile apologetically and say, "Mom's just trying to help. She's organized 100 events." Each time, Madison bit back her frustration. It was easier to nod and let the current pull her along than to start a war before the marriage had even begun. On the day itself, Madison looked radiant in her dress. Yet, she couldn't shake the sensation that she was stepping into a script someone else had written. As she stood across from Ethan, reciting vows beneath chandeliers and surrounded by the watchful eyes of Victoria's chosen guests, she felt both loved and cornered. After the ceremony, Victoria approached her with a smile polished to perfection. "You've made a wise choice, dear. My son is everything you'll ever need. Trust me, I know." The words were meant as a blessing, but they felt like a binding. When the honeymoon was canceled at the last minute, Ethan claimed a major business opportunity couldn't wait. Madison swallowed her disappointment. Instead of white beaches, she returned to her Victorian house in the Sunset District, now shared with her new husband. At first, it was sweet. Ethan cooked breakfast, left her little notes, massaged her shoulders after long days. They laughed in the kitchen, clinked glasses of wine in the evenings, and Madison thought maybe the unease she had felt was nothing more than pre-wedding nerves. But slowly the sweetness thinned. Ethan began working late, his phone buzzing with calls he always answered in hushed tones on the balcony. When Madison entered the room, he would snap his laptop shut. Envelopes appeared, legal-looking, heavy with official seals, only to be swept quickly into his briefcase. Victoria's presence grew too constant. She dropped by several times a week, sometimes bringing casseroles, other times stacks of papers she claimed were recipes or magazine clippings. Madison would catch mother and son bent over the dining table, speaking in low voices, silencing themselves when she walked in. It was during one of those evenings, when Madison returned home earlier than usual, that the shadows revealed themselves. She had left a late meeting downtown, taken an earlier train, and let herself quietly into the house. The sound of voices floated from the kitchen. "Don't rush it," Ethan was saying. His tone was tight, careful. "We don't have time to waste," Victoria countered sharply. "Last time you hesitated, and look what happened. We can't afford another failure." Madison froze in the hallway, her breath catching. Her hands trembled as she pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. Relax, Ethan muttered. This isn't like before. This time it's a whole house, not just a condo. And Madison isn't stupid. All of them think they're clever until love blinds them, Victoria said with a scoff. She'll sign when the moment is right. Just be ready. The paperwork is prepared. Madison's heart slammed against her ribs. Paperwork. Houses. Failures in the past. The words tangled into something ugly and frightening. She slipped back toward the front door, then pushed it open loudly, letting it slam shut behind her. I'm home, she called, forcing a cheerful tone. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later, smiling as if nothing had happened. You're early. Thought you had that late review tonight. They canceled, Madison replied evenly. She glanced past him and caught sight of Victoria, hurriedly tucking a stack of papers into her handbag. Victoria's smile was wide, almost too wide. Madison, darling, you look pale. Long day at work. Madison nodded, pretending weariness. Just tired. It's been hectic lately. Well, soon you'll have time to rest, Victoria said smoothly. Once things settle. The conversation drifted into pleasantries, but Madison's mind was a storm. She excused herself early, retreating to the upstairs bedroom. Behind the closed door, she pressed her palms against the dresser, her breath shaky. There was no longer any doubt. The instinct that had told her to hide her ownership of the house had been right. Ethan and his mother were circling her life like hawks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And yet, she said nothing. Not to Ethan, not to Victoria, not even to her closest friends at work. Instead, she chose silence, wearing it like armor. Because Madison understood something vital. You don't confront a predator before you know the full extent of its claws. So she smiled at breakfasts, pretended not to notice the whispered phone calls, and let Victoria's visits pass without protest. All the while, a seed of dread rooted itself deeper inside her chest, growing stronger with every passing day. She would wait and she would watch. And when the time came, Madison promised herself she would be ready. It happened on a Tuesday evening when the fog rolled in thick over San Francisco, muffling the world outside the windows. Madison was cleaning up the upstairs bedroom while Ethan was supposedly out with clients. She bent to pick up a sweater from the floor near his dresser and noticed that the bottom drawer didn't slide shut properly. A corner of paper protruded, just enough to catch her eye. She tugged the drawer open. At first, she thought it was ordinary clutter. Old receipts, envelopes, a few stray business cards. But beneath them lay a slim leather folder. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out and flipped it open. Inside were documents that had no reason to be in Ethan's possession. Property deeds with unfamiliar names. Quitclaim forms stamped with county seals. Signatures that looked suspiciously alike, as if one hand had written them all. Tucked between the pages were photographs. Older women standing in front of houses, smiling stiffly. Each picture looked staged, like proof shots for a file. On the back of one, a name was scrawled, Mrs. Henderson. Another had Clara James. Madison's eyes blurred as she flipped through them. Every face was different, but every story looked eerily similar. Women with homes, women with assets, women who had probably trusted the wrong man. At the bottom of the folder, she found a copy of a driver's license. Her heart lurched. It was Ethan's picture, but the name printed above it read David Ross. A second license showed the same face, this time under the name Michael Green. Madison's hands shook so violently that the folder slipped from her grasp and spilled across the floor. Paper fluttered around her like falling leaves. She dropped to her knees, gathering them up with frantic care. The evidence was undeniable. Ethan wasn't just secretive, he was running a game. And Victoria was part of it. Her mind raced. The whispers she had overheard. The papers Victoria had tucked hastily into her bag. The too smooth lies about business opportunities. It all snapped into place with horrifying clarity. She stuffed the documents back into the folder, replaced it in the drawer exactly as she had found it, and forced the dresser shut. Her heart pounded in her ears. She needed confirmation. Proof beyond her own discovery. Someone she could trust. That night, long after Ethan had returned home and fallen asleep, Madison sat in the dim light of her office with her phone in hand. Her thumb hovered over a contact she hadn't called in years. Angela Kim. They had met in college, two ambitious young women chasing big futures. While Madison went into finance, Angela had chosen law enforcement, climbing her way into the San Francisco Police Department's investigative division. Madison hesitated, then pressed call. Angela answered on the second ring. Madison? Wow, it's been forever. Her voice was warm but surprised. I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't serious, Madison whispered, glancing toward the bedroom where Ethan slept. I need to ask about someone. Quietly. There was a pause, then Angela's tone sharpened. Tell me everything. The next day, they met at a small coffee shop near the Embarcadero, one Angela said she trusted. Madison slid into the booth, her nerves raw. She handed Angela a slip of paper with the names she had found. David Ross, Michael Green, and Ethan's real name. Angela's brow furrowed as she read. You know these are aliases, right? Madison nodded. I need to know if there's a record. Angela promised to check what she could. But Madison, she warned, leaning closer, if what you're telling me is true, you could be in danger. People who build lives on lies don't stop until they're forced to. That night Madison barely slept. The house felt different now. Less like her sanctuary, more like a stage set where every wall hid trapdoor. 2 days later, Angela called her back. Madison answered on the first ring. You were right, Angela said, her voice grim. Ethan Brooks, real name confirmed, but he's used at least 3 other identities in the last decade. And Victoria Brooks? She's been flagged before too. Multiple reports, all tied to real estate fraud and elder exploitation cases. They've been accused of scamming women out of property, sometimes by marriage, sometimes by forged deeds. Madison's throat went dry. So why aren't they in prison? Not enough evidence, Angela replied. These people cover their tracks well. Victims often don't realize what's happening until it's too late. And by then, paperwork makes it look legal. Madison pressed her hand to her forehead, fighting the dizziness that swept over her. Images of Ethan's smile, his tender gestures, his whispered promises collided with the reality of the folder she had held in her hands. All of it, every flower, every note, every kiss, was part of a pattern. Angela's voice softened. Listen, Madison. You need to be careful. Don't confront him yet. Document everything. If you find more, bring it to me. We'll build a case the right way. When the call ended, Madison sat in silence. Rage and grief tangled inside her like barbed wire. She felt foolish for believing in Ethan, ashamed for ignoring the signs, furious at being reduced to just another file in his collection. But beneath the pain, something else stirred, a spark of resolve. She had built her life from nothing once before. She could protect it again. And this time, she wouldn't just defend what was hers. She would make Ethan and Victoria answer for every life they had wrecked before hers. Ethan called it a work gathering, insisting it was nothing formal, just a few colleagues getting together to celebrate the end of a successful quarter. He urged Madison to join him, saying it would be good for her to meet the people who supported his career. Madison dressed carefully that evening, reminding herself to play the role of supportive wife. They drove across the city to a rental space above a restaurant in Soma, the kind of place usually booked for corporate mixers. When they arrived, the room was already filled with people, glasses clinking, laughter buzzing. Ethan introduced them as his co-workers, guiding her from group to group with a practiced hand at her back. But something felt wrong. The names didn't match the stories Ethan had told her. He had once described a marketing manager obsessed with baseball, but the man she met introduced himself as an event planner. Another colleague claimed to be in sales, but knew nothing about the company's product line. Their smiles were polite, their eyes distant. They didn't ask about Madison, didn't mention work projects, didn't even seem to know Ethan well. As the evening wore on, the pit in her stomach grew heavier. These weren't co-workers. They were strangers, props in a performance. At one point, she slipped away to the restroom, gripping the counter as she stared at her reflection. Her pulse raced. Why go to such lengths? Who are these people? When she returned, Ethan was in the corner, speaking in hushed tones to a woman she didn't recognize. The woman handed him an envelope, which he tucked quickly into his jacket before noticing Madison. He crossed the room with an easy smile, kissing her cheek as if nothing had happened. Having fun? Madison forced a smile. Your co-workers are interesting. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, they're a quirky bunch. But when she pressed for details, names of departments, specific projects, he dodged, turning questions into jokes or steering the conversation elsewhere. The lies were piling up so high Madison felt she might drown in them. That night, back at the house, she tried again. Ethan, who were those people really? Because they didn't seem like co-workers. He bristled, his jaw tightening. Why are you interrogating me? Not everyone wants to talk about business outside of the office. You're overthinking. She stared at him, feeling the distance between them widen like a canyon. I just want the truth. The truth is I love you, he snapped, then softened instantly, wrapping his arms around her. Don't ruin a good thing by doubting me. But doubt had already rooted itself deep. The following day, Madison met Angela again, this time in a quiet corner of a library where Angela often worked on case notes. Madison relayed the details of the work gathering, the strangers, the envelope. Angela listened carefully, then slid a folder across the table. I ran deeper checks, she said. You need to see this. Inside were records of multiple identities, driver's licenses, social security numbers tied to Ethan's photo but under different names, bank accounts opened and closed, marriage licenses filed in other states. Each one ended with the same pattern. The marriage dissolved within a year, property transferred, the spouse left behind with debt or nothing at all. Madison's breath caught. How many? Angela's eyes were grim. At least 4 documented cases, maybe more. Every time, he vanished when he couldn't secure the assets he wanted. His mother's name shows up, too. She's listed as a witness, a guarantor, even a joint tenant on a few properties. It's a pattern, Madison, and it's organized. The folder blurred as tears welled in Madison's eyes. She thought of the women in the photographs she had found, their stiff smiles, their unaware faces. They hadn't just been unlucky. They had been hunted. Angela reached across the table, steadying her hand. You need to understand, this isn't about love. To him, you're not a wife. You're an investment, and your house is the prize. Madison closed her eyes, while rising in her throat. Every memory of Ethan, the flowers, the notes, the tender words whispered in the dark, rearranged themselves into something sinister. He hadn't fallen for her. He had targeted her, calculated her. She wiped her face, her voice low but steady. So I'm next on the list. Angela didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, Madison sat alone in her Victorian home, staring at the stained glass window in the stairwell. The house had once been her triumph, her symbol of independence. Now it felt like a bullseye painted on her back. But as grief coursed through her, anger burned hotter. She would not be another file in Ethan's folder, another photograph tucked into his drawer. If he thought she was a victim, he was wrong. For the first time, Madison let the thought crystallize into certainty. Ethan and Victoria had chosen the wrong woman. Madison had never thought of herself as someone capable of plotting. She was a woman of numbers, of spreadsheets and forecasts, someone who believed in order and discipline. But as she sat across from Detective Angela Kim in a quiet diner late one night, the steam from their coffee rising between them, she realized that survival sometimes demanded strategy. We can't wait for them to make their move, Angela said firmly. If we do, the paperwork will be in their favor, and it'll be nearly impossible to unwind. We need to get them in the act." Madison nodded, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. "They're obsessed with the house. If I make them believe my grandmother wants to transfer it to me officially, they'll push. That's when they'll try to slide in their own notary." Angela leaned back, a spark of approval in her eyes. "And if we have the right people there, the real paperwork, the real notary, they'll expose themselves." It sounded simple, but the logistics were anything but. Over the next week, Madison and Angela sketched out every detail. They found an actress, a retired theater performer in her 70s named Eleanor, who had the perfect combination of warmth and authority. With a pair of wire-rimmed glasses and a cane, she could easily pass as Madison's grandmother. Eleanor listened carefully to the plan, then smiled. "Honey, I've been playing roles my whole life. If you need a sharp-tongued grandmother who knows her way around a deed, I can give you Broadway." Madison almost laughed for the first time in weeks. Next came the paperwork. Angela arranged for a legitimate notary public she trusted to participate in the sting. The notary would prepare real documents showing a grant deed from the grandmother to Madison. Perfectly legal, perfectly binding. Alongside that, they would stage the environment, a rented Victorian home on the edge of Pacific Heights, filled with the kind of old-fashioned furniture one might expect in a grandmother's house. "Details matter," Angela explained. "If they suspect even for a second this isn't real, they'll walk. We need them greedy enough to blind themselves." Madison spread the word carefully. At dinner with Ethan one night, she dropped the line casually, as though it had slipped out by accident. "Grandma's health is worse," she said quietly, pushing her food around her plate. "She called me today. She wants to make sure the house is really mine legally. She doesn't trust banks anymore. She wants to meet a notary next week." Ethan froze, just for a fraction of a second, then smiled sympathetically. "That's good, Madison. It's important to have things secure. Do you need help finding someone reliable?" The hook was set. Within 24 hours, Victoria showed up unannounced, her eyes sharp as she perched on the edge of Madison's sofa. "Ethan told me about your grandmother's decision. Wise woman. But don't trust just any notary. We know someone who has handled family property for years. Discreet. Dependable." Madison kept her expression careful, hiding the adrenaline that surged inside her. "That might be helpful," she murmured. "Grandma can be particular." Victoria's smile was thin and victorious, as though the game was already won. After they left, Madison called Angela immediately. They took the bait. Angela's voice hardened. "Good. Now we finish this." The days leading up to the meeting were some of the longest of Madison's life. She lived in the same house with Ethan, smiled at him over morning coffee, kissed him goodnight, all while knowing that in a matter of days his entire facade would collapse. Every touch of his hand felt like a mask she was about to rip away. She rehearsed the scene with Eleanor, making sure the older woman knew every line, every reaction. Eleanor practiced signing shaky handwriting, practiced feigning confusion before declaring with authority, "This house goes to Madison." The notary reviewed the documents 3 times, ensuring every signature line and seal was authentic. Angela coordinated quietly with her team, assigning undercover officers to pose as distant relatives and neighbors who would drop by the meeting. Every detail was layered, designed to keep Ethan and Victoria from suspecting a thing until it was too late. On the night before the setup, Madison stood in her real Victorian home, staring at the stained glass window she had once loved so much. She thought about the years she had worked for this, the nights she had cried from exhaustion but pushed forward anyway. Ethan had thought he found an easy mark, a woman blinded by affection. But what he had really found was a woman who had built herself out of sacrifice and grit, and who refused to lose everything to his lies. When she finally went to bed, Ethan was already asleep, his breathing steady. Madison lay awake beside him, listening, her chest tight with anticipation. Tomorrow would be the day. The stage was set. The actors were ready. The trap was waiting. And Madison, for the first time, felt the power shift in her favor. The rented Victorian in Pacific Heights looked exactly as they had planned. Lace curtains drawn against the fading light, the scent of lavender candles in the air, a tea set waiting on the table. Eleanor, in her role as Madison's grandmother, sat in an armchair by the bay window, her glasses perched on her nose, her cane propped within reach. She looked every bit the matriarch, fragile in frame but sharp in presence. Madison arrived with Ethan and Victoria, right on schedule. Ethan held her hand tightly, the way a man might reassure his wife before an important family decision. Victoria, dressed in a navy blazer and pearls, moved quickly into the room, scanning the details with the hawk-like eyes of someone who had orchestrated dozens of these schemes. "My, what a lovely home," she said to Eleanor, her smile gracious but calculating. Eleanor gave a polite nod. "Yes, dear. I've lived in homes like this all my life. But time catches up with us, doesn't it?" She sighed theatrically, then looked toward Madison. "I want to make sure my granddaughter is secure." Madison squeezed her hands together, forcing herself to play the part of a dutiful heir. "That's why we're here, Grandma, to finalize everything." A man in a dark suit entered then, carrying a briefcase, the real notary, licensed by the state of California. He sat up at the dining table, laying out the official grant deed papers, seals, and stamp. Madison caught the flicker of irritation in Victoria's eyes. Before Victoria could intervene, she pulled a phone from her purse and stepped aside. Moments later, another man arrived, tall, thin, with slicked-back hair. He carried his own leather folder. "This is Mr. Collins," Victoria announced smoothly. "Our family's trusted notary." The room shifted. 2 notaries, 2 sets of papers. Ethan's jaw tightened as he tried to keep the scene under control. "Mom, maybe that's unnecessary. They already have someone here." "Nonsense," Victoria interrupted, her voice firm. "We should use someone we trust." The fake notary began unpacking his documents. Madison felt her heart hammering, but kept her face serene. She glanced toward Eleanor, who gave the slightest nod, her performance unwavering. The real notary spoke first, his tone calm but authoritative. "Ma'am, I've been retained for this transfer. I have the verified documents ready for signature." Victoria's smile sharpened. "And yet, we prefer someone who has worked with us before." She slid her folder across the table. Inside, the deed was altered, Madison's name alongside Ethan's, creating joint ownership. Eleanor leaned forward, peering at the papers with feigned confusion. "Why does this say both of them? I thought this was for Madison alone." "That's standard," Victoria replied quickly. "She's married now. Everything should be shared." Madison's throat tightened, anger boiling just beneath her calm expression. She had prepared for this exact moment. "Actually," she said softly, "Grandma wanted the house in my name only. That was her wish." Ethan placed a hand on her arm, his voice smooth as honey. "Madison, it's fine. It's just a formality. We're building a life together. Sharing makes sense." Madison looked at him then, really looked, at the charming smile, the polished tone, the layers of lies she now understood. And she smiled back, though hers carried a weight he didn't yet recognize. "I think," Madison said slowly, "it's time we all stop pretending." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. Setting it on the table, she pressed play on her laptop. The kitchen conversation she had recorded filled the room. Ethan's voice whispering about last time's failure. Victoria's voice insisting the paperwork is prepared. The color drained from Ethan's face. Victoria froze, her hand still on the forged deed. Before either could move, the front door opened and several figures stepped in. Plainclothes officers, blending into the scene until the flash of badges made everything real. Detective Angela Kim was at the front, her eyes locked on Ethan and Victoria. San Francisco Police Department, she announced. Step away from the table. The fake notary backed toward the wall, his bravado gone in an instant. Ethan started to rise, but one of the officers placed a hand firmly on his shoulder. Victoria's voice rose, shrill and indignant. This is a family matter. You have no right, Angela cut her off. We have every right. Fraud, attempted theft, conspiracy. You're done. Madison stood still, her hand steady as she slid the stack of documents from Victoria's folder across the table toward Angela. There's more, she said, her voice clear. Multiple deeds, forged signatures, and the photos in their possession, women just like me. It's all here. Angela nodded, gathering the evidence with practiced precision. Ethan's mask cracked completely then. Madison, he pleaded, his voice desperate. You don't understand. This is all a mistake. But Madison met his eyes, her own expression carved from stone. No, Ethan. For once, I understand perfectly. Victoria slumped into her chair, realizing the performance was over. The pearls at her neck gleamed coldly under the light, a costume stripped of power. As the officers cuffed them both, reading their Miranda rights, the room seemed to exhale. The staged home, the tea set, the lavender scent, it had all been theater, but the consequences were real. Madison felt her chest rise and fall in steady rhythm. For months, she had lived under the weight of lies. Now, at last, the truth had shattered the stage. Ethan and Victoria had no more masks to wear, no more exits to run to. The trap had closed. The officers moved with calm efficiency as they pulled Ethan and Victoria from their chairs. Handcuffs clicked around their wrists, sharp in the stillness of the rented Victorian. Madison stood rooted to the floor, watching as the people who had filled her life with fear and deceit were read their rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The words rolled out, steady and unyielding. Ethan stared at Madison, his face twisted with disbelief, as though she had betrayed him rather than the other way around. Madison, please, this isn't what it looks like, he shouted as the officers guided him toward the door. Victoria's voice was shriller, filled with outrage. You don't know what you're doing. We're family. This is a misunderstanding. But the officers didn't flinch. They ushered her out alongside her son, their protest swallowed by the night. For the first time in months, Madison felt the weight lift from her chest. She wasn't free yet, but she was safe. At the San Francisco Police Department, detectives cataloged the evidence: the forged deeds, the USB recordings, the photographs of other women. Angela kept Madison updated at every step, ensuring she never felt alone. You've done something many couldn't, Angela told her during one late-night call. You didn't just protect yourself, you gave us what we needed to stop them for good. The case moved swiftly. With the amount of documentation Madison had provided and the corroboration from other victims, women who came forward once they heard Ethan and Victoria were in custody, the district attorney's office had more than enough to proceed. When the trial began, Madison sat in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She listened as the prosecutor laid out the story: a mother and son team who targeted vulnerable women, using charm, false identities, and forged paperwork to siphon away homes and savings. The defense tried to paint Ethan as a misguided man, manipulated by an overbearing mother. They suggested Madison had misunderstood, that the joint ownership paperwork was merely an innocent mistake. But the evidence spoke louder than excuses. The jury saw the pattern: marriages abandoned when property transfers failed, financial trails leading back to both Ethan and Victoria. The voices on Madison's recording unmistakable. One by one, past victims testified. Some trembled as they described the shame of being deceived. Others spoke with anger that had simmered for years. Madison's heart broke for them, but she also felt solidarity. Together, their stories formed a wall of truth that no defense could climb. When Madison took the stand, she spoke clearly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. She described how Ethan had swept into her life, how Victoria had questioned her, how she had found the folder of aliases hidden in her own home. She told the jury about the fear, the lies, the moment she realized she had become the next target in their long line of victims. And then she described the sting operation. She didn't embellish, she didn't need to. The facts alone were damning. The courtroom was silent as she finished. She caught Ethan's gaze from across the room. His once confident smile was gone, replaced by a hollow stare. Victoria looked smaller than Madison had ever seen her, her spine no longer rigid, her eyes darting with desperation. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. The judge, his voice grave, sentenced Ethan and Victoria Brooks to years in state prison. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, final and undeniable. In the days that followed, Madison filed for divorce. The process was mercifully quick. With Ethan in custody, there was no opposition. The house, the one thing she had fought so hard to protect, was secured in her name alone, free of any claim. She walked through its rooms differently now. The stained glass window in the stairwell caught the afternoon light, scattering color across the walls. For months, she had seen it as a target, the prize her husband and mother-in-law had tried to steal. Now it shone as a symbol of survival. At night, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the fog drifting in from the Pacific. Fear no longer haunted her every step. In its place was a deep, steady calm. Relief came first. Relief that she had escaped their grip, that the law had stepped in before it was too late. Then came gratitude for Angela, for Eleanor, for every piece of evidence that had tipped the scales toward justice. And finally, satisfaction. Not the kind that shouted or gloated, but the quiet kind that hummed through her veins, steady and undeniable. Madison had faced predators who thought they could strip her of everything she had built. Instead, she had watched them fall. As she closed the door one evening, the keys cool in her hand, Madison felt the full circle of her journey. From terror to triumph, from being hunted to standing free, she had reclaimed her life. And in the silence of her home, she allowed herself a small, victorious smile. 6 months had passed since the verdict. The rhythm of Madison's life had settled into something steady, something she could finally call her own. The nightmares that once woke her in the middle of the night had quieted. The fear that had lurked in every corner of her Victorian house was gone. One foggy Saturday morning, Madison sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee warming her hands. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass window above the stairwell, casting fragments of color onto the hardwood floor. For months, she had avoided that spot, unable to look at it without remembering whispered conversations and forged papers. But now those colors felt different, like a reminder of resilience, of surviving a storm. The house had become more than shelter. It was a symbol of her independence, the monument to years of sacrifice and grit. But after everything, it meant something deeper. It was proof that she had faced down deception and walked away stronger. Each creak of the floorboards, each draft that drifted through the old windows, reminded her of her fight and her victory. Sometimes, when she let herself reflect, she thought about how easily she could have walked away at the first sign of trouble. She could have sold the house, left Ethan without confrontation, started over somewhere else. But if she had, he and Victoria would have simply moved on to their next victim, another woman blindsided by charm and false promises. The thought of that made her chest tighten. By standing her ground, she hadn't just protected herself, she had stopped them from hurting anyone else. She still remembered the look on Ethan's face in the courtroom when the guilty verdict rang out. Gone was the confidence, the easy smile, the polished mask. What remained was fear, the same fear he had once tried to plant in her. Victoria, too, had looked deflated, her sharp edges dulled under the weight of justice. Those images stayed with Madison, not as triumphs to gloat over, but as reminders that even the most careful predators could fall. Life moved forward in ways both small and profound. Madison returned to her work with a sharper instinct, no longer the woman who took every word at face value. Colleagues noticed her new steadiness, a quiet authority that came not from spreadsheets or forecasts but from lived truth. She had stared manipulation in the eye and refused to be broken. That kind of strength could not be taught. Angela remained close. Sometimes they met for dinner, sometimes just a quick call to check in. "You know," Angela told her one evening as they walked along the Embarcadero, "not everyone would have had the courage to do what you did. Most people would have run. You didn't." Madison had smiled softly. "Maybe I didn't have a choice." But she knew she had. She had chosen to fight, to stay, to gather evidence instead of fleeing. And that choice had changed everything. On quiet nights, she would sit on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, listening to the city hum beneath the fog. She let herself breathe deeply, filling her lungs with the salt-tinged air that reminded her of beginnings. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt light, free. She thought often of the women whose photos she had found in Ethan's folder. Their cautious smiles, their eyes unaware of the trap closing around them. She wished she could tell them, "I fought for you too. In stopping them, I honored you." In the end, Madison knew the real lesson wasn't about fear or betrayal. It was about trust and how easily it could be twisted. Trust but verify. That was the phrase she repeated to herself, the anchor she carried forward. Trust was necessary to live, to love, to connect, but blind trust could destroy. And another truth had crystallized. Never let anyone else write the script of your life. Ethan and Victoria had tried to turn her into a character in their scheme, a pawn in their con. But Madison had seized the pen back, and in doing so, she had written her own ending. As the months slipped into a new year, she didn't pretend the scars were gone. They lingered in subtle ways, the flicker of doubt when someone new smiled too warmly, the instinct to question motives. But those scars weren't weakness. They were strength etched into her story. One evening, as twilight spread over San Francisco, Madison stood at the top of her staircase, looking out through the stained glass window. Colors spilled across her face, amber, emerald, sapphire. She felt the weight of everything she had endured, and the lightness of what she had reclaimed. The house was hers. Her life was hers. Justice had been done. And in that quiet, steady moment, Madison allowed herself a smile, not one of bitterness or gloating, but of calm triumph. She had faced betrayal and come out whole. She had looked into the eyes of those who underestimated her and proven that she was stronger than their schemes. The story was hers now, and no one, not Ethan, not Victoria, not anyone, would ever take that away again.